Lieutenant Commander Jake Harrison had participated in enough interspecies diplomatic functions during his 5 years aboard the embassy ship Concordia to understand that first impressions often determined whether peace negotiations would succeed or escalate into conflicts that claimed millions of lives. But nothing in his diplomatic training had prepared him for the sheer physical presence of Princess Zara Velkaitos when she arrived to represent the Kytherian Empire in what everyone hoped would be humanity's most important peace treaty negotiation. The reception hall fell completely silent as she entered, her ceremonial armor catching the artificial lighting and transforming it into patterns that seemed to move with their own internal energy. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, she commanded attention through more than just impressive height. Her bearing suggested someone who had never encountered a challenge that superior skill and determination couldn't overcome, while her armor appeared to be crafted from materials that defied normal understanding of metallurgy and engineering. Princess Zara Velkaitos, announced Protocol Officer Chen with the kind of formal precision that diplomatic ceremonies required, representing the Kytherian Empire in preliminary peace negotiations with the Human Colonial Federation. Jake studied the princess as she acknowledged the introductions with perfectly correct diplomatic courtesy, noting details that his cultural liaison training had taught him to observe when working with species whose social structures differed significantly from human norms. Her pointed ears moved with subtle expressions that suggested enhanced hearing and constant awareness of environmental details, while the luminescent markings beneath her silver-blue skin seemed to pulse in patterns that might indicate emotional states or physiological responses to stress. Most remarkably, everyone in the reception hall, from Ambassador Martinez to junior clerical staff, responded to her presence with the kind of nervous respect typically reserved for natural disasters or other forces beyond human capability to predict or control. Conversations died mid-sentence when she looked in their direction, service personnel moved with exaggerated care to avoid attracting her attention, and even senior diplomatic officials maintained formal postures that suggested they were interacting with someone whose goodwill was essential but whose patience should not be tested. Commander Harrison, Ambassador Martinez said, approaching with the kind of careful composure that indicated he was processing the implications of hosting someone whose reputation had reached human space long before her diplomatic mission, "You'll be serving as primary cultural liaison for these negotiations." Princess Zara's background includes military achievements that have become legendary even among species that respect combat effectiveness, so understanding Kytherian approaches to conflict resolution will be essential for successful treaty development. Jake nodded, studying Princess Zara as she engaged in formal conversation with the ambassador's senior staff. Her responses were perfectly diplomatic, but he noticed that her interactions maintained careful distance that seemed designed to prevent casual social connection rather than simply following protocol requirements. "Princess," Jake said when Ambassador Martinez introduced him, "I'm honored to serve as cultural liaison for these negotiations. I've studied Kytherian social structures and military traditions in preparation for helping both sides understand the cultural contexts that shape our respective approaches to peaceful conflict resolution." Princess Zara's luminescent markings shifted through patterns that Jake couldn't interpret, though her response carried the kind of formal courtesy that acknowledged his role without indicating personal interest in his background or capabilities. "Commander Harrison," she replied, her voice carrying harmonic qualities that made standards sound like music given linguistic structure, "I trust your cultural analysis will prove adequate for facilitating communication between species whose fundamental approaches to governance and social organization differ significantly." "I hope so," Jake said, recognizing that her careful phrasing suggested someone evaluating his competence rather than exchanging pleasantries. "Though I should mention that successful cultural liaison work often requires learning from both sides rather than simply applying theoretical knowledge to practical situations." Something in Princess Zara's expression shifted slightly, not enough to be called a smile, but a subtle change that suggested his response had registered as more thoughtful than she'd expected from initial assessment of human diplomatic capabilities. Over the following days, as preliminary negotiations established frameworks for discussing territorial boundaries, trade agreements, and mutual defense protocols, Jake observed how Princess Zara navigated diplomatic procedures with the same tactical precision that had made her legendary as a military commander. Her strategic thinking was remarkable, her grasp of complex interstellar politics was comprehensive, and her ability to identify potential areas of compromise was sophisticated enough to create genuine optimism about treaty success. But Jake also noticed that her interactions with everyone, human and Kytherian alike, remained strictly formal in ways that seemed to isolate her from normal social connections that made diplomatic work personally meaningful rather than simply procedurally necessary. "Princess Zara," he said during one of their cultural consultation sessions, "I've been observing Kytherian negotiation styles, and I'm curious about how your people balance individual leadership decisions with collaborative consensus building during complex diplomatic processes." Kytherian governance operates according to hierarchies based on demonstrated competence rather than inherited authority, she replied, settling into the kind of instructional mode that suggested someone accustomed to explaining cultural concepts to beings whose social structures operated according to different principles. Leaders earn authority through proven capability, and subordinates provide input according to their expertise rather than expecting equal participation in decision-making processes. And personal relationships among Kytherian leadership? Do social connections influence policy decisions, or do professional competence and strategic thinking determine outcomes independent of interpersonal factors? Princess Zara paused, her luminescent markings cycling through patterns that seemed to indicate complex thought processes. Kytherian culture emphasizes duty and capability over personal preferences or social bonds that might compromise optimal decision-making during critical situations. That sounds like it could create isolation for leaders whose responsibilities prevent them from developing normal social connections, Jake observed. Isolation is an acceptable cost for ensuring that leadership decisions prioritize collective welfare over individual emotional needs, Princess Zara replied, though something in her tone suggested that the acceptability of such isolation might be more imposed than chosen. Even when isolation might actually reduce leadership effectiveness by eliminating the personal connections that help leaders understand the human, or Kytherian, impact of their decisions. Princess Zara's luminescent markings shifted to patterns that Jake had begun to recognize as indicators of surprise mixed with what might have been interest in perspectives that challenged her cultural conditioning. "You suggest that personal connections enhance rather than compromise leadership capability?" she asked. "I suggest that leaders who understand people as individuals rather than just strategic resources tend to make decisions that serve their populations more effectively than leaders who maintain emotional distance from the consequences of their choices," Jake replied. "Though I recognize that different cultures might have different approaches to balancing personal relationships with professional responsibilities." Their conversation was interrupted by urgent communication from both human and Kytherian command structures, requiring immediate attention to territorial disputes that threatened to derail the entire peace process. But as Princess Zara prepared to coordinate with her military advisors, Jake caught a glimpse of something in her expression that suggested his observations about leadership and isolation had resonated with experiences that her royal conditioning hadn't provided frameworks for processing. "Commander Harrison," she said as they prepared to return to formal negotiation sessions, "your cultural analysis includes perspectives that merit further consideration when our diplomatic duties allow for extended discussion." "I'm honored by your interest, Princess," Jake replied, recognizing that her formal language concealed genuine curiosity about ideas that her background had never encouraged her to explore. As they returned to the complex work of preventing interstellar war through careful diplomatic compromise, Jake realized that his role as cultural liaison was evolving beyond simple translation of customs and social structures into something that might help a legendary warrior princess discover aspects of leadership and personal connection that her royal training had never taught her to consider possible or appropriate for someone whose responsibilities required absolute dedication to duty over individual emotional needs. 2 weeks into negotiations that had progressed from preliminary discussions to detailed treaty frameworks, Jake had learned to read the subtle patterns in Princess Zara's luminescent markings well enough to anticipate her tactical thinking and emotional responses to various diplomatic proposals. Her approach to peace negotiations reflected the same strategic brilliance that had made her legendary as a military commander, but he'd also begun to notice moments when her rigid composure seemed to crack slightly in response to human social customs that her warrior conditioning hadn't prepared her to navigate. "The territorial boundary proposals are acceptable in principle," Princess Zara said during their morning planning session, her luminescent markings displaying the steady patterns that Jake had learned indicated focused analytical thinking. However, implementation timelines must account for Kytherian military doctrine regarding strategic asset relocation and defensive position establishment. Understood, Jake replied, making notes that would help human negotiators understand the practical requirements that made certain treaty provisions more complex than they initially appeared. But Princess, I've noticed that your people seem to approach every aspect of territorial management from military perspectives. Do Kytherians ever consider civilian or economic factors when making decisions about planetary occupation and resource allocation? Civilian welfare is protected through military strength that ensures territorial security and resource access, she replied with the kind of automatic precision that suggested someone reciting fundamental cultural principles. Economic factors serve strategic objectives rather than determining policy independently of security considerations. And personal factors? Do individual Kytherian needs and preferences influence policy decisions, or do collective strategic objectives always take precedence over what individuals might want for their own lives? Princess Zara's luminescent markings shifted through patterns that seemed to indicate complex internal processing, and Jake noticed that his questions about individual autonomy versus collective responsibility seemed to engage aspects of her thinking that purely military or diplomatic topics didn't typically require. Kytherian society functions optimally when individual desires align with strategic necessities, she said carefully. Personal preferences that conflict with collective welfare are considered problematic for social stability and effective governance. But what happens when strategic necessities require individuals to suppress personal needs that might be essential for their psychological health or long-term effectiveness as leaders? Jake asked. Do Kytherians have cultural mechanisms for helping people balance duty with individual fulfillment? Individual fulfillment derives from successful completion of assigned responsibilities and demonstrated competence in service to collective objectives, Princess Zara replied, though her tone suggested someone reciting doctrine rather than describing personal experience. Jake studied her expression, noting the way her pointed ears moved with subtle indicators of attention and the increasingly complex patterns displayed by her luminescent markings. Princess, may I ask you something that's more personal than our usual discussions about cultural frameworks and diplomatic protocols? Ask, she said, though her posture shifted to the kind of formal alertness that suggested someone preparing for potentially uncomfortable territory. During our weeks of working together, I've observed that you approach every challenge with remarkable intelligence and strategic thinking, but I've also noticed that you seem to maintain careful distance from everyone around you, human and Kytherian alike. Is that distance a requirement of your royal position, or a personal choice about how you prefer to interact with others? Princess Zara was very still for several minutes, her luminescent markings cycling through patterns that seemed to indicate emotional processing that went beyond simple consideration of his question. When she finally responded, her voice carried something that sounded like carefully controlled honesty. Royal conditioning emphasizes the importance of maintaining authority through demonstrable competence and strategic thinking rather than through personal relationships that might compromise objective decision-making, she said. Distance is required for ensuring that leadership choices serve collective interests rather than individual preferences or emotional attachments. Required by law, by tradition, or by expectations that others have developed about how royalty should behave. Required by practical necessity, Princess Zara replied. When others approach you seeking military directives, strategic guidance, or policy decisions that affect millions of lives, personal relationships create complications that can interfere with optimal leadership effectiveness. But don't personal relationships also provide information about how policy decisions affect real people, rather than just abstract strategic calculations? Jake asked. And don't emotional connections help leaders understand the human, or Kytherian, costs of their choices in ways that pure strategic analysis might miss? Princess Zara's luminescent markings brightened significantly, displaying patterns that Jake had begun to recognize as indicators of surprise mixed with something that might have been hope about possibilities her conditioning had never encouraged her to consider. You suggest that personal connection enhances rather than compromises leadership capability, she said, echoing their previous conversation but with greater interest in exploring implications that extended beyond theoretical discussion. I suggest that leaders who understand people as individuals rather than strategic resources tend to make decisions that actually serve their populations more effectively, Jake replied. And I've been watching you work with remarkable competence while maintaining isolation that seems like it might be imposed rather than chosen. Commander Harrison, Princess Sarah said, using his formal title despite their weeks of collaborative work, what makes you think that someone whose royal position requires constant strategic thinking and military decision-making could develop meaningful personal connections without compromising their effectiveness as a leader? Because, Jake said, recognizing that honesty might be more valuable than diplomatic caution, I've been working with you for weeks, and your strategic thinking becomes more sophisticated when you're discussing ideas with someone who treats your opinions as valuable rather than simply acknowledging your authority and requesting orders. You think that collaborative discussion improves my analytical capabilities? I think that you're remarkable to work with when you're engaging with ideas rather than just providing formal pronouncements, and I think that isolation might be preventing you from discovering how much more effective you could be with appropriate intellectual and emotional support. Princess Sarah's luminescent markings cycled through patterns that seemed to indicate complex emotional responses, and for the first time since Jake had known her, she seemed to be processing personal rather than purely strategic considerations. Jake, she said, using his given name for the first time during their collaboration, in Kytherian culture, warriors and leaders are expected to be self-sufficient for all psychological and emotional requirements. Seeking support or connection that goes beyond tactical coordination is considered weakness that compromises combat effectiveness and strategic thinking. And you've accepted that cultural expectation despite the isolation it creates? I've accepted that expectation because questioning it would be inappropriate for someone whose responsibilities require absolute dedication to duty over personal desires, she replied, though her luminescent marking suggested that acceptance might be more complicated than her words indicated. Princess Sarah, Jake said, moving closer with the kind of careful approach that respected her autonomy while indicating his genuine concern for her welfare, what if there were ways to maintain your effectiveness as a leader while also developing the kind of personal connections that might make leadership more meaningful rather than just more efficient? What do you mean? I mean that watching you work has convinced me that your intelligence and dedication deserve appreciation that goes beyond formal acknowledgement of your royal authority, Jake said. And I mean that isolation might be protecting you from rejection or disappointment, but it's also preventing you from discovering whether someone might value you for who you are rather than just what you can accomplish. Princess Sarah's luminescent markings shifted to patterns that Jake had never seen before, brighter, more complex, and somehow more vulnerable than the controlled displays that characterized her usual professional interactions. You're suggesting that someone might develop personal interest in me independent of my royal position or military achievements, she asked, her voice carrying something that sounded like hope mixed with disbelief. I'm suggesting that someone already has, Jake replied, recognizing that their conversation had moved beyond cultural liaison work into territory that would either deepen their connection or create complications that could affect the entire peace process. As they sat in the quiet planning room where weeks of diplomatic work had evolved into something that felt increasingly like partnership rather than simply professional collaboration, Jake realized that his role in preventing interstellar war had become inseparable from helping a legendary princess discover whether royal conditioning had been protecting her from experiences that might actually enhance rather than compromise her remarkable capabilities as both a leader and a person. 3 weeks into negotiations that had evolved from formal diplomatic procedures to collaborative problem-solving that felt increasingly natural despite the cultural differences between human and Kytherian approaches to conflict resolution, Jake found himself working late into the night with Princess Sarah on treaty provisions that would determine whether their species could build peaceful coexistence or remain locked in territorial disputes that could escalate into galactic war. The defense coordination protocols are complex but manageable, Princess Sarah said, her luminescent markings glowing with the steady patterns that accompanied her most focused analytical work. However, the cultural exchange provisions require frameworks that neither of our species has developed for managing peaceful interaction between populations whose fundamental social structures operate according to completely different principles. That's exactly why cultural exchange might be the most important part of the entire treaty, Jake replied, studying the draft agreements that would establish everything from trade routes to educational partnerships. Military alliances can prevent immediate conflicts, but long-term peace requires people from both species learning to understand each other as individuals rather than just strategic allies or potential threats. You believe that personal understanding between individuals scales up to create stable political relationships between entire civilizations? I believe that political relationships that aren't built on personal understanding tend to collapse as soon as circumstances change in ways that make strategic cooperation less obviously beneficial, Jake said. But relationships built on genuine appreciation for different approaches to solving common problems can survive challenges that purely tactical alliances cannot. Princess Zara was quiet for a moment, her luminescent markings cycling through patterns that seemed to indicate complex thought processes that went beyond immediate treaty considerations. Jake, may I ask you something about human approaches to building personal relationships that transcend cultural boundaries? Of course. During our weeks of working together, I've observed that your interest in Kytherian culture goes beyond professional requirements for effective diplomatic liaison work, she said, her voice carrying the kind of careful honesty that suggested someone approaching topics her conditioning had never prepared her to discuss. You ask questions about individual experiences and emotional responses rather than just focusing on strategic frameworks and policy implementation. Because understanding how policies affect real people is essential for creating agreements that actually work in practice rather than just looking good on paper, Jake replied. And because I've become genuinely curious about the person whose intelligence and dedication have made these negotiations far more effective than anyone expected when they began. Curious about me personally, rather than just about my role as Kytherian representative. Curious about you as someone whose strategic thinking is remarkable, whose commitment to her people is obvious, and whose approach to complex problems demonstrates the kind of intellectual flexibility that makes collaborative work feel more like partnership than simply coordinated individual effort, Jake said, recognizing that his answer would either deepen their developing connection or create professional complications that could affect the entire peace process. Princess Zara's luminescent markings brightened significantly, displaying patterns that seemed to convey surprise mixed with something that looked like carefully controlled hope. In Kytherian culture, personal interest that goes beyond tactical coordination is considered potentially problematic for maintaining optimal leadership effectiveness. And in human culture, personal interest often enhances professional effectiveness by creating the kind of mutual understanding and trust that makes collaborative work more successful than purely transactional cooperation, Jake replied. Different approaches to the same fundamental challenge of building relationships that support both individual welfare and collective objectives. You think that personal connection could enhance rather than compromise our diplomatic collaboration? I think that personal connection has already enhanced our diplomatic collaboration, Jake said, gesturing at the treaty frameworks they developed through weeks of intensive cooperation. These agreements are more sophisticated and more likely to succeed than standard diplomatic protocols typically produce because we've learned to understand each other's perspectives rather than just coordinating our respective positions. Princess Zara stood and moved to the viewport that showed the star field beyond the embassy ship, her reflected image revealing the kind of thoughtful concentration that accompanied her most important strategic decisions. But when she spoke, her words addressed personal rather than political considerations. Jake, she said quietly, I need to tell you something about Kytherian royal conditioning that might help you understand why personal connections feel both appealing and dangerous for someone in my position. I'm listening. Royal training emphasizes that emotional attachments create vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit to compromise strategic decision-making or manipulate policy choices that should be based on objective analysis rather than personal considerations, she explained, her luminescent markings shifting through patterns that seemed to reflect the internal conflict between conditioning and desire. I've been taught that isolation protects not just my own effectiveness as a leader, but the welfare of all the people whose lives depend on my ability to make optimal decisions without bias. But you've also discovered that isolation might be eliminating information and perspective that could actually improve your decision-making capabilities, Jake observed. And you're wondering whether the protection that emotional distance provides might cost more than the vulnerabilities that connection creates. Exactly. Princess Zara turned from the viewport to face him directly, her luminescent markings now displaying patterns that seem to convey both vulnerability and determination. And I'm wondering whether someone whose cultural background includes different approaches to balancing personal relationships with professional responsibilities might be able to help me understand alternatives that my conditioning never allowed me to consider. What kind of alternatives? Alternatives that would allow me to explore personal connection without abandoning the duties and responsibilities that define my role as a leader whose people depend on her strategic thinking and diplomatic capabilities, she said, her voice carrying the kind of careful hope that suggested someone contemplating possibilities that felt both essential and forbidden. Jake moved closer, recognizing that their conversation had reached a turning point that would determine whether their professional partnership could evolve into something more personal without creating conflicts that compromised either his diplomatic effectiveness or her royal obligations. "Princess Zara," he said, "what if personal connection actually made you more effective as a leader by providing the kind of emotional support and intellectual partnership that enhanced rather than distracted from your strategic thinking?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that watching you work has convinced me that your intelligence and dedication become even more remarkable when you're collaborating with someone who appreciates your capabilities rather than just acknowledging your authority," Jake replied. "And I mean that the kind of isolation your conditioning requires might be preventing you from discovering how much more you could accomplish with appropriate support and understanding. You're suggesting that developing personal relationship with you could enhance my effectiveness as Kytherian diplomatic representative rather than compromising my ability to serve my people's interests." "I'm suggesting that developing personal relationship with me might help you discover aspects of leadership and strategic thinking that isolation has been preventing you from exploring," Jake said. "And I'm hoping that you might be curious enough about those possibilities to consider whether the risks of connection are worth taking for the potential benefits of partnership that goes beyond purely professional collaboration." Princess Zara's luminescent markings cycled through the most complex patterns Jake had ever observed, seeming to reflect emotional processing that involved fundamental reconsideration of assumptions that had shaped her entire approach to personal relationships and professional responsibilities. "Jake," she said finally, "if I were to consider exploring personal connection that transcends our diplomatic duties, what would that exploration involve? How would human approaches to relationship development accommodate someone whose background and responsibilities differ so significantly from normal civilian social expectations?" "It would involve learning about each other as individuals rather than just as professional colleagues," Jake replied. "It would involve discovering whether our intellectual compatibility and mutual respect could develop into emotional connection that enhanced both our personal welfare and our collaborative effectiveness. And it would involve taking whatever time and care necessary to ensure that personal relationship supported rather than compromised your duties as a leader whose people depend on her wisdom and strength. Even if personal relationship required me to acknowledge emotional needs and vulnerabilities that royal conditioning has taught me to suppress or ignore. Especially if it required that," Jake said. "Because acknowledging emotional needs and vulnerabilities doesn't make someone weak, it makes them complete enough to understand the full range of human experience that effective leadership requires them to serve and protect." As they stood together in the quiet planning room where weeks of intensive diplomatic work had created the foundation for both interstellar peace and personal connection that transcended the cultural boundaries both their species had assumed were insurmountable, Princess Zara's luminescent markings settled into patterns that seemed to convey decision-making that balanced careful strategic analysis with emotional courage that her conditioning had never taught her she possessed. For weeks into negotiations that had transformed from formal diplomatic procedures into collaborative partnership that seemed to transcend every cultural barrier between human and Kytherian approaches to problem-solving, Jake found himself working through the final treaty provisions with Princess Zara in the embassy's secure planning room. The late hour and intensive mental effort had created an atmosphere of shared concentration that felt more intimate than any of their previous planning sessions. "The final territorial agreements are acceptable to both sides," Princess Zara said, her luminescent markings glowing with patterns that Jake had learned indicated satisfaction mixed with exhaustion from weeks of complex negotiation. "The trade protocols will require ongoing coordination, but the frameworks are sound. And the cultural exchange provisions should create opportunities for both species to develop understanding that supports long-term peaceful coexistence." "More than that," Jake replied, reviewing documents that represented months of careful diplomatic work, "these agreements are more sophisticated and more likely to succeed than anyone thought possible when negotiations began. We've created something that serves both species' interests while establishing precedents for cooperation that could influence interstellar relations throughout this sector." "We," Princess Zara repeated, her luminescent markings shifting to patterns that seemed to reflect complex emotional processing. You credit our collaborative effort rather than individual contributions from each species negotiating team. I credit partnership between people who learn to understand each other well enough to create solutions that neither could have developed independently, Jake said, studying her expression as she processed treaty documents with the kind of focused intelligence that had made their work together so remarkably effective. Princess Zara set aside the final agreements and turned to face him directly, her luminescent markings now displaying patterns unlike anything Jake had observed during their weeks of collaboration, brighter, more complex, and somehow more vulnerable than the controlled displays that characterized her usual professional interactions. "Jake," she said, using his given name with the kind of careful intimacy that had developed during their late-night planning sessions, "now that our diplomatic duties are essentially complete, I need to ask you something about the personal connection we discussed yesterday." "What do you need to know?" "I need to understand how someone moves from professional respect and intellectual compatibility to the kind of personal relationship that you described as enhancing rather than compromising individual effectiveness," she said, her voice carrying the same analytical precision she applied to strategic planning but focused on emotional territory that her royal conditioning had never prepared her to navigate. "Usually it begins with honest acknowledgement of feelings that have developed during collaborative work," Jake replied, recognizing that their conversation was approaching territory that would either deepen their connection or create complications that affected both their personal and professional relationships. "And it continues with discovering whether mutual attraction and shared values provide foundation for building something meaningful together." "Honest acknowledgement of feelings," Princess Zara repeated thoughtfully. In Kytherian culture, emotional expression that goes beyond tactical necessity is considered potentially problematic for maintaining optimal strategic focus. And in human culture, emotional honesty is considered essential for building relationships that support both individual welfare and collaborative effectiveness, Jake said. "But Princess, what matters isn't what our cultures typically expect, what matters is what we think might work for us specifically, given our individual personalities and circumstances." Princess Zara was quiet for several minutes, her luminescent markings cycling through patterns that seemed to indicate complex internal processing. When she finally spoke, her words carried the kind of careful decision-making that characterized her approach to important strategic choices. "Jake, if I were to acknowledge feelings that extend beyond professional appreciation for your diplomatic capabilities and intellectual contributions to our treaty development, what kind of response would you consider appropriate?" "Honest response based on my own feelings rather than diplomatic courtesy or professional obligation," Jake replied, moving closer with the kind of careful approach that respected her autonomy while indicating his genuine interest in wherever their conversation might lead. "And your honest response to the possibility that I've developed personal interest in you that goes far beyond what royal conditioning taught me was appropriate for someone whose responsibilities require absolute dedication to duty over individual emotional needs." Jake studied her expression, noting the way her luminescent markings had brightened with something that looked like hope mixed with fear about possibilities that her background had never encouraged her to consider. "My honest response is that I've developed similar feelings, and that I've been hoping you might be willing to explore whether what we've built as professional partners could evolve into something more personal. Even though personal relationship with me would involve someone whose royal position creates obligations and expectations that could complicate normal relationship development. Especially because it would involve someone whose intelligence, strength, and dedication have impressed me more than any person I've ever worked with," Jake said, reaching out to touch her hand with the kind of gentle reverence that acknowledged both her royal status and the emotional courage required for their conversation. Princess Zara's luminescent markings responded to his touch with patterns that seemed to convey both surprise and something that might have been profound relief. "Jake, I must tell you something that my royal conditioning has never allowed me to share with anyone." "What is it?" "In all my years of royal training, military service, and diplomatic responsibilities, no one has ever." She paused, her luminescent markings cycling through patterns that seemed to reflect emotional processing that challenged her ability to find appropriate words. "No one has ever acknowledged me as beautiful rather than formidable, admirable rather than intimidating, or valuable as an individual rather than useful as a political and military asset." Jake felt something tighten in his chest as he realized the profound isolation that Princess Zara's royal status and warrior reputation had created. "You're saying that no one has ever told you that you're beautiful?" Royal conditioning emphasizes capability and strategic value rather than aesthetic appreciation, she replied, her voice carrying carefully controlled emotion. Others respond to my authority, my combat achievements, my diplomatic effectiveness. But personal qualities that exist independent of my official role have never been. She trailed off, her luminescent markings displaying patterns that seemed to convey vulnerability that her training had never equipped her to express. Princess Zara, Jake said softly, moving even closer as he realized that his simple observation might represent something she'd never experienced, you are beautiful. Not just your luminescent markings or your elegant features, but the way your intelligence lights up when you're solving complex problems, the way your dedication to your people shines through everything you do, and the way your strength combines with unexpected gentleness when you think no one is observing. Princess Zara's luminescent markings exploded into patterns of such brightness and complexity that they seemed to overwhelm her entire sensory system. Her expression shifted through surprise, wonder, and something that looked like emotional overload as she processed the first aesthetic appreciation she'd ever received that wasn't framed in terms of her utility or authority. You think I'm beautiful, she whispered, her voice carrying amazement that suggested she was processing a completely foreign concept. I think you're the most beautiful person I've ever known, Jake replied. Beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with your royal status and everything to do with who you are when you're being yourself rather than performing official duties. The effect of his words was immediate and dramatic. Princess Zara's luminescent markings flared so brightly that they illuminated the entire planning room, her breathing became shallow and rapid, and her legendary warrior's composure completely shattered as she processed emotional input that her conditioning had never prepared her nervous system to handle. I don't. She began, then swayed on her feet as the overwhelming nature of receiving personal appreciation rather than professional acknowledgement created a feedback loop that her enhanced physiology couldn't regulate. Jake caught her as her knees buckled, her 7-foot frame collapsing against him as consciousness fled from someone whose emotional systems had been overloaded by the first expression of personal beauty she'd ever received. Her luminescent markings continued pulsing erratically as her body processed the shock of being valued for aesthetic and personal qualities rather than strategic utility. Princess Zara? Jake called softly, supporting her weight while checking for signs of medical emergency. Her breathing remained steady and her pulse was strong, but her luminescent markings indicated the kind of systemic overload that resulted from processing experiences that existing neural pathways couldn't accommodate. When she regained consciousness several minutes later, her first sight was Jake's concerned face looking down at her with the same gentle appreciation that had triggered her collapse. Her luminescent markings settled into patterns that seemed to convey embarrassment mixed with wonder. I fainted, she said with obvious disbelief. I am a trained warrior who has survived combat that would challenge enhanced soldiers, and I fainted because someone called me beautiful. You fainted because your nervous system had never processed the experience of being appreciated for personal qualities that your conditioning taught you were irrelevant to your value as a person, Jake said, helping her sit up while maintaining the supportive contact that seemed to stabilize her luminescent patterns. And because receiving that kind of recognition created emotional responses that your royal training never equipped you to handle. Jake, she said, her voice carrying the kind of careful vulnerability that suggested someone discovering new aspects of her own emotional capacity, what you said about my being beautiful, did you mean it as diplomatic courtesy, or as honest personal observation? I meant it as honest personal observation that I've been wanting to share for weeks but wasn't sure would be appropriate given our professional relationship, Jake replied. And I meant it as the beginning of showing you appreciation that goes beyond your royal status to acknowledge the remarkable person who happens to be a princess. Princess Zara's luminescent markings brightened with patterns that seemed to convey profound relief mixed with something that might have been joy. So when you look at me, you see beauty rather than just authority that requires careful management. When I look at you, I see someone whose intelligence amazes me, whose strength inspires me, and whose beauty, physical, intellectual, and emotional, makes me grateful for every moment we've spent working together, Jake said. I see someone I'd like to continue getting to know, if she's willing to explore what might develop between us. Even though exploring personal relationship with me means accepting someone whose emotional responses are apparently unstable enough that compliments about beauty cause fainting episodes. Jake smiled, helping her to her feet while maintaining contact that seemed to help regulate her luminescent displays. Especially because it means helping someone discover emotional experiences that her background never allowed her to develop, and learning together what personal connection looks like when it's built on genuine appreciation rather than strategic convenience. And you believe that someone who faints when called beautiful could develop the emotional stability necessary for meaningful personal relationship? I believe that someone brave enough to acknowledge vulnerability and strong enough to process completely new emotional experiences has exactly the qualities necessary for building relationships that support both individual growth and mutual partnership, Jake replied. 6 months later, as final peace treaty ceremonies concluded successfully and both species began implementing the cooperation frameworks that Jake and Princess Zara had developed, their personal relationship had become a model for how individual connections could bridge cultural differences that entire civilizations had assumed were insurmountable. Any regrets about fainting when I first called you beautiful? Jake asked during one of their evening conversations, noting how her luminescent markings now displayed steady patterns of contentment when they discussed personal topics. My only regret, Princess Zara replied, is that it took so many years for someone to see me as beautiful rather than just formidable. Though I suppose some discoveries require exactly the right circumstances and exactly the right person to become possible. And my only regret, Jake said, is that I waited so long to tell you what I'd been thinking since our first meeting. But I'm grateful that when I finally found the courage to be honest, you found the strength to let yourself hear appreciation that your conditioning had taught you was impossible. Their relationship had indeed proven that beauty and strength could coexist without contradiction, and that the most meaningful connections developed when people were brave enough to see past official roles to appreciate the remarkable individuals hidden beneath the expectations that society had created around authority, duty, and the careful distance that leadership often required. Princess Zara had learned that being called beautiful didn't diminish her effectiveness as a leader. It enhanced her understanding of the full range of human experience that effective leadership existed to serve and protect. And Jake had discovered that helping someone learn to accept appreciation was one of the most beautiful experiences two people could share, regardless of the cultural boundaries that seemed to separate their worlds.